I thought we could begin with class introductions, and given that this is a geography class and the topic is architecture, I'd hope that everyone could offer a place or geographic setting for themselves and maybe mention their favorite building. In my case, I'm Jeff Bianco. I'm a retired architect and grew up in the West Bronx and lived in northern Manhattan until my family dragged me into the wilds of Connecticut. And my favorite building is the Empire State Building. It's a sketch I did of it. And interestingly, when the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, polled the general public about 10-15 years ago, this was the winner of the beauty prize for America in general. Welcome to Architecture for Geographers. I'm hoping that by sharing an architect's thoughts on the built environment, this course will help you develop some new critical thinking tools for the analysis of architecture and its links to its cultural, historic, and particularly geographic contexts. I also hope that my enthusiasm for the subject might enhance your appreciation of architecture in general. To that end, I thought we might begin with an absolute highlight. I chose this plan and elevation of Bramante Tempietto in Rome as our first image because even though it's small in stature and scale, it is absolutely sublime and one of the high points of the Italian Renaissance. In 1502, Bramante built the Tempietto to mark the historic location of St. Peter's martyrdom in Rome. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain funded the project for him. And here it is in all its glory. I admit that it took my breath away as a young student on my first visit. Clearly, this is architecture. But given that this is the topic of our full semester, I thought we might begin with a class discussion on the definition of architecture. If every one of you can contribute a word or phrase that points us in the right direction, we might create an impression of its scope. Now for the remainder of the first half of our class today, I will offer a narrower and more technical and sometimes legal definition of architecture. Architecture is a profession restricted by each of the 50 states, and most other countries as well, to those who are licensed by the state to practice it, in order, as it's most commonly phrased, to promote and protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. As an aside, architects are required to continue education every year, and a certain amount of typically 8 credits per year of HSW, as we call it, health, safety, and welfare credits are required. Each jurisdiction typically varies their definition of architecture, possibly to structures of a given size or sometimes different functions. But essentially, the common gist is that architects design places for occupancy and use by people. I say places and not necessarily buildings. Let me illustrate with these examples that we're showing here. Yankee Stadium is an unenclosed structure. 50,000 people or more, though, might attend a game there. It has to be designed by an architect. Upper right corner there, a building solely housing machinery, allowing for only occasional access by trained personnel for maintenance, can be designed by an engineer without an architect. Lower right corner there, courtyards present an interesting example. Typically, frequently, landscape architects will design the outdoor spaces of a project as consultants to architects, including decorative courtyards that have restricted access only to maintenance staff. However, in the case of, for instance, this courtyard here at J.M. Wright High School that I designed in Stamford, while the landscape consultants made planting plans for the space, I had to draw and stamp the drawings for the space itself because students are allowed to use it. In fact, the structurally decorative canopy you see there on the left side, I designed is intended to allow them to make a shortcut from one wing of the building to the other, so essentially it's an outdoor corridor. So how does one become licensed to practice architecture in the United States? It's a long, arduous, and uncommon path, no matter how you approach it. Uncommon in that there are nearly an order of magnitude more physicians and lawyers than architects. But ultimately, all those paths begin here. This is the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. For architects in America, this is the mothership. In 1846, Richard Morris Hunt became the first American to matriculate into the École des Beaux-Arts, And after having graduated and worked in Paris on the 19th century restoration of the Louvre, he returned to New York to open a prolific practice. This is his design for Marble House on Belmont Avenue in Newport. He was alone in this level of training till the equally renowned H. Richardson, Henry Hobson, attended in 1860. It was soon followed by a whole generation of Beaux-Arts architects. But Hunt alone deserves the credit for being the progenitor of professional practice in the U.S. They brought back more than just their new skills, but the professional traditions of the drafting studio, the ateliers of the école, that it's transformed into and created the design studio culture of the U.S. schools and offices. American architects speak in French jargon still derived from the programs at the école. We say we're on charrette when we're working around the clock to finish on time, just as the French students had to complete their presentation boards before the charrette, or the cart, rolled past their desk. We poche our plans to finish them by filling in the poches, the pockets, with cross-hatching, and we add entourage, the people in landscape, vehicles, furnishings, etc. to enliven our renderings. But even more importantly than their design work was their devotion to establishing the architecture as a profession in the U.S. and in training the next generation. One of Hunt's earliest protégés, William Robert Ware, in addition to his design career, became the first professor at MIT School of Architecture, which was the first program in the United States, and then went on from there to found Columbia School of Architecture as well. This is a contemporary design studio at MIT today. Hunt's greatest claim to fame, however, is that he was the impetus and one of the founders of the American Institute of Architects, our professional organization. The AIA played the crucial role in developing the practice of architecture into a profession, and still does to today, and is dedicated to training the next generation always. Most architects use the initials AIA as their significator of their professional status. And as a past president of AIA Connecticut, you can see I'm still proud of that and use that as my official signature still. That last image from the MIT studio has led me off on a tangent for a moment. Please forgive me. Some traditions we're lucky to have lost. And I don't know if you noticed, but the major difference between the 19th century atelier and that MIT studio is that 50% of the students or more were women in 2022. When I entered school over 50 years ago, there was one woman in my entry class, so I'm happy to say that many more graduated with me that came in as time went over. This is a picture of my partnership before I retired. And I'm happy to say that while I started the firm as a sole practitioner and took in a bunch of other old guys as partners, through the years we did get more diverse. And once I retired and dragged the other geezers off with me, the two women that you see here are left as 50% of the ownership of the firm. And Symphony Bailey Green, my protege on the left side of me in the photo there, not my left side, but the other left side, I groomed, to be the new managing partner of the firm, but she didn't want to take that on, but she is the financial director of the firm, so in large part she does have most of the role anyway. Returning now to our main plot line, the first steps towards your architectural license is a professional degree from an accredited architectural program. The National Architectural Accreditation Board has to approve any new programs offered by any institutions before they get temporary preliminary authority to offer classes. And then they revisit and reapprove existing programs every 5 years. This is important. Consequently, there are very few universities that offer the program. Yale was the sole program in Connecticut for many years till the University of Hartford began offering one and has been accredited in the past 10 years. And when I went to school in New York, I had only 6 programs, including the City College School of Architecture, my alma mater. These are some beautiful images of the new, gorgeous building they've had that Raphael Vignoli designed for them about 5-10 years ago, including that gorgeous roof terrace lecture hall that looks out across Harlem and south across the South Central Park, towards the Empire State Building and the rest of downtown. and has that beautiful atrium in the center of it that all the studios open off of. There are two flavors of professional degrees one can get in architecture. Either a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture or a 2 or 3 year Masters of Architecture, depending upon your undergraduate degree. In my case, I took the full 5-year route straight out of high school, and I'll describe my course of studies as being pretty typical. First year, you begin with a year of prerequisites for the technical side of things, so a year of physics and calculus, statics and strength of materials, and then that follows that as 4 years of building technologies and engineering. At the same time, you take 5 years of architectural history and theory, and most influential and most time-consuming of all are the 5 years of architectural design studio. Those 8 hours of studio time and then the 40 hours a week that you put into design time is all-consuming and what develops your passion for the rest of your career. Many programs have a formal portfolio review stage before your third year that you have to pass in order to continue on, but in all schools there's a pretty high attrition rate. Consequently, there are a lot of semi-architecturally trained people in other arts, particularly music very frequently. Architecture is known as the frozen music, so I guess that's where that comes from. And then some people actually graduate and go on to completely different careers. As a New Yorker, my two favorite are Columbia School of Architecture, matriculates, 1920s. Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse of the Yankees, had attended Columbia School of Architecture, and in the 1950s, Sandy Koufax, was a graduate of the School of Architecture and was starting his career when the Dodgers picked him up. And both of them are Hall of Famers, but neither one designed anything. Unlike other professions, you have not earned the title architect with your professional degree. Instead, you have to apprentice for a minimum of 3 years to an architectural firm or work under the direct supervision of an architect. For example, as if you were working for a government agency in an architecture department. The National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, or NCAR, provides a national clearinghouse service for licensing issues. They monitor and review each candidate's IDP progress, the Intern Development Program progress. That requires that their supervisor and an independent mentor architect sign off as they complete each phase of practice experience. Architects take these volunteer roles seriously. You need to encourage the next generation, but the public deserves to ensure that only qualified applicants get licensed. While interns are typically thrilled to be learning in the real world, the amount of practical knowledge left to the profession to teach them is daunting, and unfortunately, the average intern takes more than 7 years instead of 3 years of training, meaning that the average age of new licensees is over 32 years old. Once you've successfully ticked all the boxes of your internship, you've finally reached the last hurdle, and you're allowed to register for the state licensing exams. In my day, they were only offered twice a year, so you typically had to wait another 6 months before you actually got to sit. And nowadays, they're computerized, so they're always available. But unfortunately, this actually has slowed the process because without the pressure of a deadline, a lot of candidates procrastinate. In my case, I had completed my 3 years of working designing mainly hospitals, and I've got to sit for my exams in December of 1979. And the exam consisted of 2 8-hour days of history and theory, 2 days of building technology questions, 1 slog fest of a 12-hour design project. In my case, it was a branch library, and I was charretting to complete it on the 12th hour, believe me. And finally, 3 days of professional practice questions, legal contractual questions, zoning, building code type of things. I've received my license 3 months later, in March of 1980, and continued to work for other firms to begin with. A short stint for a small firm on Manhattan's Upper East Side, mainly designing for Sotheby's. And then finally, my last stop was a boutique firm specializing in preservation work, my most personal mentor, Giorgio Cavalieri, where I earned the secondary distinction of being an historic architect, which is a federal qualification in the Department of Interior. These images are of the Pension Building, now the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., with a drawing that I did of it, a project that we were the historic architect consultants to Washington, D.C., museum firm. You get to see it on TV once every 4 years because it's where the largest inaugural ball for the president is held. At this point, I thought we might begin by addressing the semi-burning question of, but what does the architect do anyway? And let's begin with a historical look back of how we've gotten to the standard of practice that we've got today. In 1887, the AIA began their first efforts at defining the roles of the players in the construction project drama with their first general conditions for the construction contract, which lays out the responsibilities of each of the parties. And one odd thing and unique in business is that the architect is the first arbiter of what the contract is between the contractor and the owner, because the architect prepared the contract by drawing the drawings and writing the specifications. By 1918, they had codified a set of interlinking agreements between client and architect, the A101, between the engineer and architects, consultants, and the general conditions and agreement between the owner and contractor. This established a standard of practice for the industry that's the standard even when other agreements are used. The A101 traditionally was called Basic Architectural Services, and that's the most typical approach. You know, it's the vanilla that other flavors are added into to change it around, and so I'm going to describe that for you. And that entails 3 phases of design, then bidding and negotiations assistance, and construction administration. As I would explain to interns or students, each phase of design is overall intended for a given audience. Schematic design is intended to convey information to the client. Under basic architectural services, the client is supposed to arrive to the architect with a survey of the property that they own, a written building program, and an idea of a budget for the scope of work that they want to accomplish. Oftentimes, parts of that information aren't available to begin with, and the architect might provide pre-construction services or a pre-designed study to help the client get to that first start-off point. During the practice of schematic design, then the architect will typically develop a number of schemes, usually 3 to give, an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, for the client to choose between that shows different dispositions of the spaces and different arrangements and their budgetary impact. Once the client has selected one of the schemes, they will then develop that into a full set of schematic documents that shows the aesthetics of the project, the scope and size of all the spaces in 3 dimensions, and develops the initial budget. The second phase of design is called design development, and here the audience is the design team itself. This is where the engineers typically get involved for the most part, and we're now working out and making this schematic design a buildable object so that the engineering is worked out, the dimensions of spaces include all the thicknesses of all the materials that are being made, and it comes together in an object that is able to be constructed. The final design phase is called contract documents, and the audience for these documents are the construction companies bidding for the opportunity to build the project. Every design decision needs to be clearly documented so that disputes between the owner and the ultimate builder as to what they bought are minimized. A usual standard of care is to budget for 2% of the construction cost for changes to the contract, which is really pretty tight considering that each building project is a one-off, and they take several years to complete, so unforeseen things that impact the project cost happen all the time. For example, there could be an undocumented buried oil tank that has to be removed as hazardous waste, or some equipment that was selected is no longer available by the time the project is being built, or there's a strike, or new public regulations come into effect that you can't be grandfathered in for. Consequently, the contract documents are highly detailed. On this project, there were over 200 E-size drawing sheets. That's 34 by 44 inch size sheets, as this one is that you're seeing, and thousands of pages of written specifications. A large part of the architect's efforts are spent in coordinating the designs of the consultants. Remember that engineers' natural primary concern aren't the people's outside of using their facilities outside of their own discipline. Exaggerated, but kind of typical example is a mechanical engineer on the drawing could show ductwork that provides adequate ventilation for the space but no headroom for the people walking through. That's a kind of silly self-inflicted wound, but where the architect really has to come into play is making sure that each of the disciplines are coordinated with each other, that the ductwork aren't taking the space of structural equipment, that the fire ratings for penetrations for any of the mechanical types of things going up through the building are done adequately and provided by the architect's drawings. It's very complicated. This is the area of practice where the famous dictum by the famous architect Mies van der Rohe does come into play, which is God is in the details. In the last two phases, a great deal of the architect's efforts are spent on the financial aspects of the project. During bidding and negotiations assistance, the architect will help the owner find qualified builders to bid on the work and assists in evaluating their offers. It's often apples to oranges, and understanding the trade-offs can be complicated. And then finally assists with negotiating the terms of the construction contract and prepares the documents themselves. Then during the construction administration phase, each month the architect will review the contractor's applications for payment, corroborating that the amount of progress made is correct and that the work satisfies the design intent. A great deal of effort is also given to reviewing the work prior to its actual installation. Contractors are required to prepare shop drawings for specific trades, demonstrating that the work is coordinated with the other trades and also that it meets the design intent. And cut sheets or catalog specifications for all equipment are reviewed. Colors, textures, etc. Specifications are selected at that time often, as well as also actual field work and checking what's going on. In this picture, members of the design team, architects and engineers are inspecting with the general contractors, concrete contractors, mechanical trades prior to the casting in stone. The single biggest concrete pour I'd ever seen, nearly a half an acre of concrete and 16 inches thick in a single day. Now we've finally arrived at the project closeout phase of the project, where we assist closing up and wrapping up the project. One of my favorite smells in the world is latex paint, meaning we're coming to the end. Part of the major negotiations we did at the beginning of the project come into play here. We negotiated the contractor's schedule of values. If it were up to them, they would say that the foundations cost 90% of the project and everything else was 10%, and they would get paid everything up front. Obviously, that gets negotiated to a reasonable balance between the contractors and the client's interests. And then each month, we typically will also hold a retainer back from the client for closeout costs of the project. And we prepare what we call a punch list, where we've walked around and made a list of anything that's missing or anything that's dinged or the paint is wrong or things need to be finished and corrected. And as we are closing out, walk through and punch out the list, ideally getting to the end where there's nothing. It is a negotiation and a little bit of a dance that we have. And then the final step for basic architectural services is for the architect to prepare and sign a certificate of substantial completion, which certifies that the project is completed substantially in accordance with the contract documents and everything is satisfactory for the health, safety, and welfare of the public particularly. And at that point, then the owner can apply for and get their certificate of occupancy from the authority's jurisdiction, and they can start using the building. Occasionally, clients will want some extra services of post-occupancy services. In this case, we did provide marketing assistance to the client in marketing these apartments for rentals. But finally and ultimately, you get to move on to the next project and start all over again. One intriguing commonality between the studies of geography and architecture is that while both are focused and rooted in the study of place, they're both very open-ended and nearly boundless in their interests. As I'm sure you're all aware, geographers can pick up any topic practically and focus on the place aspects of it as a geographic study. Similarly, architecture, just even looking at the design aspects of it from a design perspective, are very open-ended and polymathic in their scope of interests. The examples I'm showing here are the very famous Alto Savoy vase that he designed for a restaurant he was designing. In the center is an example of one of my partners designed a couple of bridges. This one's on I-95 in Rhode Island. The bridge won the design award from the Society of Bridge Engineers the year that it was designed, and they noted that they wished more architects would be designing bridges. And then lastly, on the lower right is the elevation of the University Club on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The funny story here is that the architects were looking to put the plaques of each of the universities that they were going to share in the use of the club on the facade. And the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, didn't have one. So they designed one for them and put it on for free. Because we love designing so much, architects can get trapped into that factor of designing for free at times. I've done it myself. I designed a public building where I've included and expanded out to do some traffic calming on the street in front of it. And I didn't realize how much they suckered me in until they were having me look at presenting to the Department of Transportation about a traffic intersection half a mile away from the project. In many cases, we love buildings. The scope that we're interested in looking at can go from the macro on our project to the, down to the microscopic, but typically we're always looking at the order of magnitude context outside of what we're committed to do. Architects may be introverts or extroverts, but the complexity and scale of the typical architectural project requires that it be played as a team sport. Even the most narcissistic architects that I've ever met have been great collaborators and know how to work with others and play nicely in the sandbox in terms of the design project itself. As I explained when describing basic architectural services, a great deal of an architect's practice is spent as essentially the orchestra conductor of a given project. He or she is working with the team that consists of the design teams, the clients, the builders, public officials, and the public. Today is Bramante Day for us, so this sketch is showing that we collaborate not only with the stakeholders that I've just explained, but with the past as well. This is his sketch for his initial concept of St. Peter's, overlaying it on top of the existing structure that was there at the time, the medieval basilica that was there from before. On occasion, you're playing the team sport doesn't end even when you're gone. These gorgeous drawings that Bramante did of his scheme for St. Peter's never got to be completed by him, but they did inspire Michelangelo's plan and concept that he did get to build and that we get to see today. Another commonality between geography and architecture are the conventions we use to convey our abstract view of the world, at least at the scale of neighborhoods and towns, where we describe the two-dimensional plans as if viewed from an infinite distance. In other words, there's no perspective shown. Everything is flattened out to be as if it's perfectly perpendicular to the observer. And we can use geometry and trigonometry on these drawings and to accurately calculate areas and distances while ignoring the topography. The topography can, of course, be indicated as contour lines as separate information. This is termed iconographic cartography and was first developed by Leonardo da Vinci in this plan of Imola near Bologna, Italy. And he drew it for Cesare Borgia in 1502, the same year as Bramante's Tempietto. Mechanical drawing, or technical drawing, of which architectural drafting is a specialized subset, uses the same technique of eliminating perspective by imagining a view from an infinite distance to create orthogonal views of an object that can be measured and scaled, the same way that Leonardo developed this technique for the mapping of towns. Architects use 8 of the other orthographic projections all the time. This image of a cut pepper illustrates the 10 typical views. On the top row are the plan on the left, and the top plan, or roof plan as an architect would call it, equivalent to the iconographic town map plan. In the center row on the left-hand side are 2 cross sections. A longitudinal section will be cut along an object's major axis, while a transverse section cuts along a minor axis. In the pepper's case, it's nearly symmetrical, so they're both transverse sections. Next, we have the 4 elevations of each side: left, right, front, and back. Normally, building elevations will be labeled by the compass points for which they face. For example, the north elevation faces north, and the one that's in the shadow the most time in our hemisphere. On the bottom right is an image looking up underneath, it's the bottom of the object. This is something that architects don't draw. We don't look at the bottoms of buildings. But the left-hand side, the second plan there, is similar to a reflected ceiling plan, which is a tricky convention in architectural drafting. We don't want to draw the ceiling looking up at it, reversed from the orientation of the rest of our plans. So what we do is imagine there was a layer of a couple of inches of mercury poured into the bottom of the plan, and you're looking down at that and seeing the ceiling reflected down onto the plan in the same orientation and relative to all the rest of the construction. Architects use these tools of orthographic projections to think about objects and spaces. They will read a plan and then envision the whole building as they would have completed it in their mind. The ability to create a 3-dimensional mental model of objects and spaces is the principal talent needed for success as an architect. Many architecture programs give spatial orientation quizzes like these 2 samples to test for this ability as a part of an admissions procedure, because I believe it is an inherent talent. At least it's very difficult to teach. I would pause here to see if you'd like to try and figure these out, and I'll give it a second. The answer to the first one is the lower left, and the answer to the second one, the bottom question, is the upper right. That's not to say that architects don't do perspective renderings or create physical models or digital models. This is an image from a digital model I made of the Wesleyan bookstore on Main Street that I designed. That's the cafe banquette there. But it is to say that our first thoughts in designing something is probably a plan doodle, and then maybe a section doodle, and then finally maybe a slightly refined sketch of an elevation before we possibly pass it off to the next generation to work on some more. Now for the last few slides before we take a break, I thought we might take a little closer look at a few architectural drawings to familiarize ourselves and learn some of the conventions of architectural drafting. This is the ground floor plan of Baker House, Alvar Aalto's fabulous project on the Charles River in Cambridge. An architectural floor plan, the convention for that is that it's taken as a section, essentially plan section, cut at 4 feet above a given floor plan. Looking down, you then see floor patterns, as you're seeing here, any furnishings. You see beds, chairs, and tables here. And the pieces that are cut, in other words, the walls, columns, things that would be in section at 4 feet above the floor, are shown with a heavy dark line and then pochade on construction drawings to show what the materials are, or as in this case a presentation drawing, just pochade in black. I can tell this is a presentation drawing that was prepared probably in ink for publication in a print magazine at a small scale. It's clearly not, a drawing that the architect's office prepared for while they were designing the building. This next sheet is an actual drawing from Aalto's office, produced probably during the design development phase of the project. It's a plan of the next floor up from the last sheet. We can see here the famous round skylights on the roof below us that covers the dining room on the floor below. The original drawing was pretty clearly pencil on vellum, and this is a working print from it. It has a few pencil doodles and annotations that would have guided the design team in revising this sheet, probably the next day. I inserted the little overlay as an example of redlining that illustrates one of the primary methods of design studio. At the end of the day, the drafter, or whenever the supervisor wishes, will pull a print of his work for someone higher up the design food chain to red mark with revisions or corrections. The next day, the drafter can then make the corrections by erasing the vellum and redrawing in pencil again, and then yellows out the print to record that they actually made the corrections to the original drawing. In the 70s, we started drafting with plastic leads on mylar sheets because, being more translucent than vellum, they made crisper prints. But one impact of this was that erasures wore through the tooth of the mylar more quickly than on the traditional material. So we learned how to draw on the reverse side of the mylar and became adept at even lettering in reverse on the back side. I included the second overlay of the architectural lettering to demonstrate one of the absolutely required skills of the drafter. You had to, and you still even have to, learn how to letter like an architect in school, or you'd never progress even to the beginnings of your apprenticeship. This was a dues-paying tradition, but founded in the practical, if mainly aesthetic necessity of having many hands on a given drawing as it was revised, lots of people work on it, and by multiple team members, and needing to maintain a consistent look to the sheet. This is a transverse section through the main lobby and dining hall of Baker House with the 5-story residential levels above, and a ghosted elevation of the building portions to the west of the section cut. The most important art in making section drawings is to plan and where to cut them. Typically, all 4 elevations of a building and the plan of every floor need to be drawn, and when multiple floors of a building are identical, one plan will suffice and be labeled typical plans 3, for the levels 3 through 10, for example. But sections are infinitely different throughout the length of the building, and the art is to cut them where they explain the most information in the building. Because time is money for architects particularly, as we're essentially selling our time, and the last drafting you need to do that still describes the design, the better. Drafting conventions for a section include using a heavy line weight for the elements cut by the section, and light or even ghost lines for elements seen in elevation behind them. And then typically, again, we'll show in poche the actual construction materials. This is a presentation drawing, so it's black poche throughout. Sections can look in either direction on the given cut line, and this is a choice to make as well to explain the most you can. The plan diagram on the upper right shows where the section was taken, and this is usually indicated on every floor plan cut by the section with arrows also at the ends of the section cuts showing the direction that we're looking in. This beautiful elevation is a clean print from a pencil original from Alto's office. This is the north elevation of the building, unusually the entry and at the same time the rear of the building. The brilliant concept, or partie in Beaux-Arts jargon, is that the serpentine plan of this building of Baker House allows for the maximum number of dorm rooms to face south and have river views, while the more opaque and less fenestrated facade faces the cold northern exposure of Amherst Alley. Another extremely clever and humanistic detail of the design is shown on this side of the building. The staircases connecting the residential floors, rather than stacking above each other as every other building in the world, except for maybe a couple other Alto projects or homages to his work, here continue in a straight line up the rear facade of the building. You can see them stepping up east and west from the center meeting at the second floor on the elevation there. They create a decorative expression on the facade by cantilevering their full width off the rear wall, so that wall maintains still a fire barrier protecting the stairs from the interior. But the true glory of the scheme is seen in the interior, where these stairs provide a glorious ascending corridor connecting the floors with a magnificent experience instead of the typical climbing a half-light, heading a landing, half-light back, and then closed drudgery. depending on the scale and complexity of the building project, the majority of architectural sheets will actually look like this one. Large-scale detail sections that describe the actual construction of every element of the building. They might even, as this one does, include an illustrative axonometric three-dimensional sketch to explain some particular complexity that otherwise would require multiple details. A great deal of training of architect interns involves drafting details and picking up the red marks each day, because even after 5 years of technical courses, they will still need thousands of hours of office experience before they know how to put a building together. We'll close out this section of the lesson today with this blow up from the beautiful elevation. It shows the lovely line work that the drafter had, and then the relative exterior as built. And now we'll take an intermission with a little bit of light music from contemporary times, contemporary to Bramante's projects that we looked at earlier. Moving into a less concrete, more abstract take on our topic, I'll now pose the question, what distinguishes architecture, with a capital A, as one of my professors used to say, from plain ordinary vanilla building? As an aside, I'll offer an old joke. What's the difference between a vase and a vase? A vase costs more than $20. Obviously, it's an old joke because $20 doesn't buy what it used to. But in terms of architecture, I have a personal, I admit it's subjective definition that I've used my entire career, and I'll offer it to you. At least it does come from a distinguished authority of high pedigree, Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. 2,050 years ago, Vitruvius, as a retired architect, wrote his 10 books on architecture as a gift to Emperor Augustus in order to pass on his professional knowledge. It's the only full text on architecture to have come down to us from antiquity and was a primary source for the renaissance of classical architecture. This woodcut from a 15th century translation certainly looked familiar, clearly a pretty direct inspiration for Bramante. The famous dictum from the text has guided many in the profession to this day, firmitas, utilitas, e venustas, or as I learned in translation 50 years ago, firmness, commodity, and delight. In addition to setting the goals for good practice, this maxim is useful as a format to learn about architecture. As I mentioned, many professional degree programs are organized into 3 sections: structures, technology, history, and theory and design. And we'll use it as well. The rest of our course will follow these tracks with the goal of better appreciating firmness by developing a visceral, physical understanding of structure and construction materials. Commodity, recognizing that architecture is a practical art. It must serve a purpose, and someone has to pay for it. And we'll learn about the economics of the built environment as well as social constraints and impacts on building. And finally, delight, by introducing aesthetic concepts, for example, anthropomorphism, as exemplified by Da Vinci's rendering here of the Vitruvian Man, human scale, whole number and other proportion systems, and by encouraging the palpable experience of architecture through all 5 senses. Particularly, I'm going to emphasize the experience of walking around, pedestrianism, and experiencing architecture and geography. We'll mix a little bit of each attribute into each week because the art of architecture is balancing the 3, and hopefully it will keep it interesting as well. I will include explanatory examples from my own work and aspirational examples of some of my favorite architects and buildings each week as well. The text for the term is Experiencing Architecture by Steen Eiler Rasmussen, an honorary fellow of the AIA. It's from MIT Press, and it was published in 1959. Each week we'll read one chapter of the book, and our class discussions will relate directly to that chapter. It's a lovely book, really one of my favorites. It's elegant, pretty simple, and it's described in its preface. It says, it endeavors to explain the instrument the architect plays on, to show what a great range it has, and thereby awaken the senses to its music. Mr. Rasmussen was an architect from Denmark and mainly taught primarily in the U.S. at Harvard, I think, and Berkeley. He didn't design many buildings, but he did have a prolific career as a planner. The other two books are suggested readings. The course won't directly tie into either of them, but they might broaden your appreciation of architecture, spatially and setting in the context of time, if you read or skim either of them. The first is Towns and Buildings, again by Mr. Rasmussen, and also published by MIT Press in 1969. And this earlier book of his was written before the other, as well as he wrote another book about just London, presents an architect's perspective on the integration of buildings and their geographic settings, maybe a little more contextual in some sense for us. Another good book. And then the last one, the second one, is How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand, Penguin Books, 1994. Mr. Brand most famously was the editor of the Whole Earth catalog. In the late 60s, my generation's cool kids mashup of counterculture and Wikipedia. He wrote this book in the post-me era of the early 90s, and it explains how architecture can last for generations by adapting to new uses. In other words, don't build buildings that are too specific and flimsy, but build robust buildings that can capitalize on their embodied energy and maintain a long and useful life. For this course, we will have 9 short weekly assignments and 1 long-term project. In architectural studios, students present their progress each week to their classmates for a crit, short for the Beaux-Arts La Critique. Kind of a blend of romper room caring and sharing, and there will be blood. To get a sense of this adventure, we will prepare a short reaction piece or design exercise based on the reading for that week each week, and give a brief 2-minute max presentation to your classmates for mutual input. Beginning at Lesson 5, each student will choose a topic for their term end project. Generally, I would think it would take one of 3 paths. Either create an architectural guide to a region, town, or neighborhood, or prepare a monograph for a given building type or program type, or a single architect's body of work. Or critique an existing design, for example, review a campus site plan and graphically present proposed modifications, or develop an idealized plan for a utopian scenario. And now I'd like to make a note on the presentations themselves. Architects are obsessed with aesthetics, page layout, typography, quality of images, and public speaking and personal presentation all should be conscious decisions when sharing with the class. For our first assignment, we'll note that buildings may be background structures or landmarks. In all cases, architects typically strive to be contextual. This image of Society Hill in Philadelphia is an example of contextual background buildings blending to create a glorious neighborhood. After reading the preface and Chapter 1 Basic Observations, please take a half-an-hour stroll and prepare a graphic appreciation, sketches, or photomontage of the background buildings you observe with the new tools you've acquired from this first chapter. This is a geography class, so please include an ethnographic map of your route. If circumstances don't allow for a pleasant stroll, Google street map views or an illustrated guidebook or an old photograph, and your mind's eye will do for the source material. To wrap up for today, we'll escape from the classroom to take a short walking tour of our own Bassett Hall, looking for some of the complexity of design, and then continuing on to nearby Davidson Hall to compare a college building designed for the same client in a very different era, noting changes in construction, materials, and aesthetics.